Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this RPG review I'm going to be looking at the D&D 5th Ed Monster Manual. This is by Wizards of the Coast. It's by multiple authors and it comes in at just under 350 pages and costs just under £30. That's in British pounds. Now, as you may or may not be aware, I'm somewhat jaded when it comes to monster manuals. If you want to see more of my issue with monster manuals, you can have a look in the video there where I talk about it extensively. Now, normally I prefer to do quite an in-depth review when it comes to RPG supplements, analysing the content. But given that a monster manual is basically a big list of creatures for you to use in your game, I feel a somewhat different approach is required. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at a few things: the art and layout, the type and quality of the creatures, and if there's any other extras in the book. And then I'll just wrap up with a little verdict at the end. So before we get on to the main list of creatures, there is an introduction in the book where the format of the stats that are going to be featured is introduced, and there's some very basic consideration given to what makes a monster and where they might live. This information is absolutely fine, but you shouldn't really be expecting anything world-shattering at this stage. The intro will look very familiar to anyone who's owned a D&D monster manual in the past. There's some basic info on creating appropriately statted challenges, although when it gets to a certain point, the monster manual directs you to the, as yet unpublished at the time of filming this video, Dungeon Master Guide. Now, that's fine when all the books are out, but at the minute it does feel like a little bit of a cop-out. Would it really have taken much more to just put in an extra paragraph or two to give it a bit more of an explanation? Who knows? But it would have been a nice thing to see. One thing I do like, however, is the introduction of legendary creatures. And effectively these are creatures that can take extra actions out of their normal initiative turns. And this may sound a little bit bland, but the suggestions offered in the book all generally tie in to the creature's background, lair, or even both of them, giving you a few little extra cool things that you can do to emphasise that the players are on the monster's turf. Now, I like this quite a lot, especially the suggestion that the mere presence of certain monsters warps or alters the land around their lairs to a certain extent. And you could really imagine like the old style vampire lord or something similar in their castle, the trees starting to die in the landscape around, the animals becoming a bit more predatory and a bit more vicious. That's an idea I really like, and it's a nice little extra to see included in the book. So we move on to the art and layout. The book is laid out in a pleasingly uncluttered format with nice bold headings breaking up the ecology info for the various creatures. And in my opinion, it's nice to see a return to a more detailed ecology after the somewhat abbreviated monster entries in the various 4th edition monster manuals. The artwork in this full colour book is also beautiful. I mean, if you can see it there, look at that cover with that beholder on it. And I'm just going to flick to a few random pages to show you some of the artwork quickly. If you can see the ever favourite creeping claw there. And let's face it, it's pretty difficult to make a severed hand look interesting. We have the warlike hobgoblin there, another excellent piece of artwork. And let's just pick a final one. Turning to the animals appendix, we there have the death dog, a 2-headed beast. Another great piece of artwork. And that high quality of artwork is maintained throughout the book. And at least 99% of the graphics are really great. So let's move on to the actual creatures in the monster manual. And I read somewhere in someone else's review that D&D 5th Ed Monster Manual feels like a best of from other editions. And in a way, I do feel that's quite true. There are the old favourites that appear in almost every monster manual. Your orcs, gnolls, hobgoblins, etc. Plus a lot of old D&D favourites like the Crawling Claw I mentioned a moment ago, the Tarrasque, etc. As I said earlier, it's great to see the return of interesting ecology information. And each has a number of bold paragraph titles that tell you the basics about a creature at a glance. Just to give you an example, the Cyclops has the titles of non-religious, unsophisticated and unwise, and that really gives you a sort of punchy breakdown of the creature's behaviour, even if you're just glancing at the page, which is a great thing to see, and it gives you an instant hook into how the creature might behave. However, there are some monsters that seem to only really be in the monster manual because they're a bit of a tongue-in-cheek reference to previous editions. I mean, come on, Flumps, really? Give me a break. Whilst it is funny on some levels, I'll admit, I would rather have seen those pages put towards something more interesting. There are some monsters, though, that have been given a bit of a facelift for the better. For instance, the aforementioned Tarrasque. Now, I have to admit that when I first saw the Tarrasque in the contents page, I groaned inwardly. Yes, I know it's supposed to be the ultimate terrifying destroyer of worlds and all that other horrifying stuff, but really all it seemed to me in previous editions is that it's some ludicrously high-level creature that was stupidly hard to kill, but that otherwise seemed to have little to no reason to actually exist in a campaign world, without the GM doing an awful lot of work to work it in, obviously. However, now, by giving the Tarrasque use of a number of legendary actions rather than just ramping up the stats to a ridiculous degree, the creature still seems fearsome without having any ridiculous kill conditions associated with it. For instance, if I remember correctly, there was some condition in one of the previous editions where you had to use a wish spell to even kill it and reduce its hit points to minus 9,000 and some other ridiculous total. So it's good to see that even creatures as high as this, and it's still a high challenge rating, it's still challenge rating 30, however it's no longer this ridiculously unkillable beast. So that was good to see. Okay, so are there any extras in the monster manual? Well, the only real extras worthy of note, in my opinion, that I noticed were the legendary actions that I've already discussed, and there's a couple of appendixes at the back. One which we looked at when we saw the Death Dog information, which features animal stats, which are useful, but aside from a couple of exceptions, aren't really that interesting. And another featuring generic NPC stats, which would be quite useful during a campaign. So my verdict is, and I realise that the review thus far may have sounded a bit negative and like I've not enjoyed the book, but let me assure you that isn't the case. The D&D Monster Manual does what it sets out to do in a very well organised and efficient manner. However, aside from a few little flecks of genius here and there, plus the absolutely amazing artwork, and just to show you some more of it, why don't I flip to the Dragons page, since we are talking about Dungeons and Dragons after all. If I have a look for the iconic red dragon of the setting, you can see just one of the many gorgeous pieces of artwork there. Aside from that, though, you're not really going to find anything that you've not seen before if you've ever owned a different edition D&D Monster Manual, or a Monster Manual for any other fantasy role-playing game. If, however, this is your first Monster Manual, you are in for an absolute treat. And even if not, no doubt it will be very useful in 5th edition games. However, at £30, it's not one of the cheapest Monster Manual style books available. But for a book with such gorgeous artwork and with all the creatures you could ever need in a Monster Manual, I think that it's a pretty decent buy overall, and I'm quite happy to have bought it and very much enjoyed reading it. My only hope is that, as with some previous editions, that Wizards don't go to OTT with bringing out Monster Manual 2, 3, 4, etc. And I'll probably end up doing a Bugbears video on ridiculous numbers of Monster Manuals later. But in terms of this first 5th ed Monster Manual book, if you're looking for a tome containing a best of D&D monsters from previous editions, or if you're running a D&D 5th ed game, or if you just want some truly gorgeous artwork for iconic creatures of the D&D mythos, then you really won't go wrong or be disappointed with this book. So, I hope if you've enjoyed this video, you'll consider clicking on like and subscribe. You can subscribe to the channel by clicking on the red dice up there. If you have any comments, as always, leave them in the box below or hit me up in the Google Plus links. I really do enjoy reading what you write. So until I see you next time, thank you very much for watching and for listening. Take care.